All right, all right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. What does test optional mean for me? I'm very excited to be co-presenting with my friend and colleague, Ginger Fay. Hello. We go back a decade or so when she was back in DC and all the conferences and everything else. And Ginger, she's been through admissions all over the place, Duke and Emory and other places. So she knows things. And we work together here at Apple Ruth, and we're going to be doing some back and forth with our slides tonight. So the way we'll structure it, we're going to have, we'll give our deck, and then we're going to have time for questions and answers. A few points, we always send you a recording. So in the event there are things that we covered a little quickly, you can go back and play it again. You can share it with friends, colleagues, spouses, children. And also, we're going to send you a copy of the slide deck. So we'll have a PDF going out to you. So if there are certain details you want to capture from the slides, those are coming to you within a couple of days. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in, and we're happy you're here tonight.
We did want to start with one question for them, Chad, before they start asking questions of us.
So right.
So we are going to launch just a quick poll, just so we have a sense of our audience tonight. Are you a student, a parent, or an educator? And what high school class are you or the student you're representing hoping to graduate in, I guess. Let's be more confident. You're going to graduate.
We're going to graduate.
For sure. But we'd love to get a sense of the folks who are with us tonight, so we can be thoughtful about orienting our conversation around sort of making these decisions right away if you're a senior, planning a little bit further ahead if you're a little bit earlier in your high school career. And wherever you are, this is a good time to be thinking about these things and asking these questions. It's never too late or too early. Like, it's always good to gather information, and it's good to get to this process when you're ready for it. So not to worry, wherever you are is a great place. We just want to know about it. So thank you for answering our poll. And now that you've answered our questions, if you do have questions throughout the evening, feel free to pop them into the Q&A box as they occur to you. And Jed and I will try and get to as many of those as we can tonight. So please feel free to pop the questions in as they occur to you. And we will sort of hold a good chunk of time before the hour is up to answer any of those questions that you have. So now, without further ado.
No further ado's. All righty. Thank you, G. All right. So jumping in, there's something we've heard before. I heard the tests are optional this year. They're optional tests. And part of it is, and you have to always use that high-pitched voice. That's a thing I use a lot with my daughter when I read stories. But ultimately, the tests have always been optional. But if you didn't take the tests, that limited the scope of schools to which you could apply. During the pandemic, it's blown wide open. Optional is actually the law of the land for the majority of schools in the country. So now you have a choice. Do I send, not send? But they were never required except for certain, there's certain states where they're part of a graduation requirement. That's fairly rare. But now you really have a choice. Do I take them? Do I prep for them? Do I send my scores in? And these are questions we'll be hitting tonight. So in terms of testing, we got our little quad matrix. Tests can be either required for admission. I can't apply without them. They can be optional. They can be flexible in terms of how they use tests. And then they could be blind, or now they're calling it also test free or score free. So those are our four categories, which we'll talk about all those. So test required is fairly simple. This was the way it was for decades. And pre-pandemic, this was the dominant position in the country for the vast majority of colleges. And so you couldn't, they wouldn't consider an application complete without having a test score. So these tests were on equal footing. And then, many schools in the country have shifted to self-reporting, where, you can actually, until you're accepted, you can report your scores, and then you validate them by sending the score report that you pay the ACT or the College Board to send on your behalf. And so this is now a minority position in the country. So it was the dominant one pre-COVID, pandemic happens, and very few schools in the country require testing for admission. Some of the more prominent ones that you may know of, our home state here of Georgia, this summer, they reinstated testing requirements. So if you were going to apply to one of the 20 or so Georgia schools in the Georgia system, whether it's Georgia Southern, Georgia State, or Tech, or UGA, and that's often where the best deals are for people in that state, you must have a test score. Florida never dropped the requirement. They have a lot of their tests are tied up with merit-based scholarships and guaranteed entry. They never abandoned testing, even during the pandemic. And it didn't really change things in terms of the number of kids who applied to Florida and Florida State. There really wasn't a big shift. They were nervous at first, but still kids found a way to get in their testing. In terms of the South, you see those two, we have contiguous states there, Georgia and Florida. And Rick Clark, he is the head of undergrad admissions at Georgia Tech. He knows friends and colleagues at the other partner schools. He says, don't count on the South for dropping testing. And even though right now the Carolinas, Alabama are optional, Rick felt like there is a decent chance that several of those states or all of them may in fact require testing again. And so, because again, they have similar positions, they use testing for scholarships, for guaranteed admission and so forth. So we'll see what happens, but there is a good chance after the cycle of admissions, we're going to see more states going back to their previous policies. So now, when it comes to test optional, what that means is a application is complete with a test score or without one. And they're going to give you a full unbiased review with a score or without a score. So you have a choice. You're in the driver's seat. Do I send or withhold? And so schools are going to get applications that are complete with and without test scores. And so they're going to review it. If you send it, if you don't, it's not part of the conversation. Now, right now, during this pandemic, test optional is the dominant position. It used to be a very minority position, but now it's the law of the land in most schools. We have, of the 2,500 four-year colleges, 1,600 plus of them are optional. So that's in a lot of the schools that are more selective, because there were many schools who were optional pre-pandemic, but they weren't the top name schools. It was happening with Chicago, Wake Forest, George Mason. Little by little, there's a trickle effect of more schools going optional. But after COVID, this was a flood of top schools in the country who are now optional. And so we expect this to remain. And so many schools, they were optional for 1 year and they began putting in their extensions. And so many top schools in the country, they just said, whatever we did last year, keep it going. We haven't heard changes from, the top schools from, the Penns and the Dukes and the Emorys and the MITs and Pomonas. They're all sticking with their extensions for optional. And then there are several schools doing multiple year optional, even beyond this year, like Amherst, Penn State, Illinois, Pitt, Williams, the University of Tennessee, they're doing a 5-year trial. So there are a number of schools who are extending this thing to see what happens and get more data. All right, so one of the key things that happened when the country went test optional, we had a flood of applications for the very top schools who for years and years and years, kids didn't apply because they didn't have test scores in the right ranges. And they may have had the grades and the academic rigor, but their test scores weren't competitive. And so those kids opted out of the pool. When these colleges went test optional, everybody applied, especially to the name schools. That was a massive phenomenon. And we know, schools who were selective became much more selective. NYU had a massive increase. UCLA, Duke went through the roof. Colgate in one single year, and they doubled their number of applications, which is amazing. And so we see here some of the selectives just getting much, much tighter. Colby went from 13% rate of acceptance to 8, Williams 12 to 8, MIT 7 to 4, Emory 19 to 13, Duke 11 to 5. These are major changes. UGA they went from 46 to 39. So these are big changes. The Ivies are getting ridiculous. And so we saw massive changes where Dartmouth with 9 to 6 and Penn 9 to 5 to 7. So all this is saying that if you were thinking about applying to a school that was selective before the pandemic, well, now it is more selective. And so that's just part of the challenge. More kids are applying, and the number of spots haven't changed. So that's something that's a real phenomenon. All right, I'm going to hand things over to Ginger.
Thanks. So Jed has explained testing required and test optional. I want to define two of the other terms he mentioned. One is test flexible, which really means there's an alternate path to admission. They would like to see some standardization in the application, but it doesn't have to be the SAT or the ACT. So students could submit, they could not apply, they could apply without test scores if their GPA was over a certain threshold. They could submit results from other standardized tests like AP exams, for example, or writing samples in lieu of the SAT or ACT. This was an option for more schools before the pandemic. Most of the schools that had test flexible policies before the pandemic have gone to test optional during the pandemic, and what will happen afterwards, we don't really know. And then to go to the next slide, we'll talk just a little bit about TestBlind, or as Jed explained, it's also called TestFree or score-free at some schools. Less than 50 schools have opted to go TestBlind for the next year. And that means that even if scores are submitted, they will not be considered as part of the application review. Their systems are actually set up to strip the scores from the application before anyone reads it. So there are about 20 schools that have gone to a permanent test-free or score-free evaluation, and another 20 or so are engaged in pilot programs and won't make a long-term decision until they have more data for themselves of what happens when they make this kind of change. So TestBlind, if we want to go to the next slide, it really has been a result of the pandemic, and particularly has impacted places where the pandemic was a huge issue for everyone very early on, and had really limiting factors for people in terms of being able to actually gather in a group as you would when you're doing standardized testing. So the California state system is one of those systems that went TestBlind as a result of the pandemic. And then there are some schools, a couple of Catholic schools, Catholic University in Washington, D.C., Loyola in New Orleans, and some other schools that have opted to go TestBlind because they were able to read, evaluate, and evaluate applications without testing, and they wanted to keep doing it. Now, if we can go to the next slide, as Jed explained, TestOptional really is the dominant position. And so most students will really be in the driver's seat when it comes to their application process, and they can decide whether or not they want standardized testing to be a part of their process. For some students, it will be to their advantage to submit test scores to some or many or all of the schools they apply to. And for other students, they will put their time and energy into other parts of their application. On the next slide, Inside Higher Ed is one of my favorite resources for sort of, if you're an admissions nerd like me and you've been applying to college for 25 years, you kind of always want to hear what's the latest and the greatest. And they do a lot of surveying of higher education institutions, and most schools reported that they expect their schools who have adopted test optional policies during the pandemic to maintain that after the pandemic. So we'll see what happens. So the ACT similarly has a vested interest in whether or not people will be taking standardized testing at the same rate that they did before. And so they invited Ernst & Young to do a survey for them. And the estimate is that about a third or so, maybe less than a third, quarter to a third of schools will require testing. The majority of schools will be test optional. And then this small sliver, as we've been talking about, will maintain a TestBlind program like the University of California system has decided to do. But as I mentioned before, most colleges really need to figure out what life without a piece of the application process looks like, not just in the admissions process, but most importantly, what happens to their students after they enroll. So they want to know, are their graduates winding up the same when they admitted them without considering test scores as they did before? So are the college GPAs similar from before and after changing these policies? Were students who enrolled in the school ready for the rigor of that college's curriculum? Were they able to retain students at the same rate after their first year and graduate them within a 4, 5, or 6 year period, depending on how the school evaluates that? So there's a lot. Jed is someone who loves data, and there's a lot of data that's coming through the pipeline during these years. And colleges want to wait and see before, many of them are hoping to wait and see before establishing a long-term policy, what the impact is of practicing test optional admissions during this particular time period. There are some systems, however, that have made permanent, or as permanent as anything is anymore, decisions. So that includes the state of Washington, and they have all agreed that going forward, the public colleges and universities that are part of that system will now permanently be test optional. You'll notice that Jed and I have talked really exclusively about colleges and universities in the United States. I would mention that lots of people might be interested in looking at colleges in other parts of the world, and I would just mention that many of those systems actually rely a little bit more on standardized testing of some sort than some of the schools in the US. So this advice and this perspective is sort of more directed towards our 50 states. And if you're looking to apply to schools outside the US, you may find that it is more important and compelling for you to have standardized testing be part of that. So we've tried to put together this conversation tonight to address many of the questions that we've been hearing from folks over the last several months. So I've been asking questions of Jed, and he's going to put together some answers for you. So one question that we've heard a lot is, what's the difference between test optional and TestBlind, right? So if a school is test optional, what does that really mean? How will my scores factor in? So on the next slide, we'll see that test optional, of course, doesn't mean TestBlind. It means that that scores will continue to be a factor in the admissions equation. Strong test scores can really help a student's application stand out. They can improve your chances of not just admission, but securing a merit-based scholarship at some particular colleges. And we'll talk about some of those examples tonight. So Jed, I wonder if next you could kind of talk a little bit more about how some individual schools have clarified their policies, since it doesn't feel like one size fits all. Even when it comes to this terminology, there are some schools that say they're test optional. It doesn't feel like they're as optional as
Right.
the policy is meant to be.
Right, definitely. So let's have a gander at that. So part of it, like Cornell, when they made their announcement, and they're interesting. They've 8 colleges. 3 of them are doing a TestBlind pilot. I forget exactly which schools, architecture, and there are 2 others. But then their other 5 schools, they made clear that for those of you students who are applying without test scores, we're going to actually have increased scrutiny in other areas of your application. So we're going to be looking more closely at your GPA. So your grade trends matter more. The level of rigor matters more. Other testing you have, if you have any AP scores you give to us, you have 4s and 5s, that'll factor in more. Your essays, counselor, teacher recs. So and this just makes sense that if we're pulling out an important component, everything else has to fill in the gap. So that's not so surprising in that regard. But schools, there's really a question that you're gonna find out of, should I submit my score or not? That's the reason many of you are on this webinar tonight. If I have test scores, is it in my advantage to send them, or should I withhold them? And this is where it comes down to strategy. And we know that a weak test score, you typically do not want to send. A weak test score, it's the same thing if you have a weak outcome, like that's information more for yourself. Like for you choose many things on the Common App, what you report, what you withhold. And if there is, like, you did an activity for a few months and quit, you wouldn't tell them that. Versus, how many weeks, how many months, how many years, if you stay with the thing for 3 or 4 years, that's something you would advertise, but not I tried for 2 weeks and quit. That wouldn't go on your Common App activities list. And so the same way as, you'll send your 5s on your APs and your 4s. If you get a 1 on an AP, you would withhold that. That would be for you to know about, not to share with them. And so giving them a weak test score is not going to help your cause. However, if you score well, that can show a strength, show a level of ability, show a facility with this kind of assessment. And it can give more context if you're on the fence or on the borderline with your grades are okay, but then you have a very strong test score. They may read that and say, okay, this student has potential. There may have been some other issues or things at play, but obviously if you get a 35 on the ACT, there's some real horsepower there. And so testing also, as you mentioned, may affect merit-based aid. There are many colleges who allocate merit aid based on grades, rigor, and test scores. And so without test scores, that'll really be a factor for a lot of colleges out there. And so if you don't submit your testing, even though you can have admission to a school, you may be opting out of a pool of merit-based financial aid that often hinges upon your grades and test scores, because there are a lot of strong students who have very good grades. There's been a lot of grade inflation for the last 30 years in the country. So having A's isn't nearly as special as it once was. A lot of kids have A's these days. And then talking to admissions officers, some of them say, like, what kind of A's do you have? It can be a factor. Do I have 97s or 91s? But also, when you have a pool of students all with very high GPAs because of all the grade compression over the past several decades, test scores are often more of a differentiator, and they distinguish things more. And there's been some research, other schools, even California put out research, that with the grade compression we've been seeing over the past several decades, that test scores are actually better predictors now than they were 20 years ago, and grades are weaker predictors. That's interesting, because schools, they're grading differently, and there are more kids where the average grades for a high school class are just rising. At my high school, I see that other schools and affluent schools, zip codes, private schools, we've seen a lot more grade inflation over the years, for the past several decades. So there are schools out there who, again, a few examples we picked, Wabash School College, they are very clear. If you have good grades and good test scores, they begin to give you more financial merit-based aid based on your scores and your grades. So as my GPA goes up and my test scores follow in suit, my academic award for, my, again, not need-based, but merit-based, can go from $17,000 a year off tuition if I have a 22 on the ACT and a 3.0, up to a 29. They're going to knock off an extra $15,000 a year. So that's very substantial for a family based on a test score and a GPA level. So things you can get. Alabama is very famous for using merit-based aid. They've spent over 110 million. Like they really are aggressive with this, and they've transformed their class. Now you wouldn't recognize the Alabama freshman class from what it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, where you have, I think 40% of the kids have like a 3.9. You have like over a quarter of the class, like a 30 or above. And the average test scores, everything's risen. Average GPA, way up, Alabama. Average test score, way up. Graduation rates, way up. They've used merit-based aid to transform their school. And so other schools have taken notice. And now they're attracting over 4/10 of their population at Alabama just from out of state, which wasn't the case at all 20 years ago. So they're pulling kids all over the country with their very attractive merit-based financial aid. And you see here this matrix, they're given a 3.5 GPA, which is honestly quite standard. Around the country, it's not so exceptional anymore. As your score increases from a 27, they're knocking off 8,000 a year. You get one measly point on the test, which you can get probably in a couple hours of work. They're going to knock off over 4 years, $8,000. That's an amazing return. You get one more point, you just save another $20,000 over 4 years. Up to a 30, that's another $36,000 you saved. And then you get a 32, and whereas tuition out of state was $30,000, for you it's $2,000 a year. That's compelling. And you go to the honors program. That's why people are there, cross applying to Duke and Dartmouth, then they end up going to Alabama on a full scholarship. So that's happening, and then they have a whole different alumni base, and they give more XY over the years. It's the whole thing they're doing. It's part of their strategy, but they're being super generous with merit aid now, hoping to get a return over time from the higher quality students. And so ultimately, the rates of test submission and admission, that really is what's interesting to us, to families. Is there a difference? Does it really matter? If I send scores or not, will there be an edge or an advantage? That's the real question. Historically, schools who were test optional for several decades, about 80% of students who applied and who were accepted to these test optional schools had test scores. So schools who were famously optional, like Bates and the Bowdens and Wake Forest for about 14 years or so, still over 8 in 10 of students who were accepted had test scores. So there was always a lane of kids who didn't have scores, but it was a small lane. It was 10% of kids. 12. When Chicago went optional in 2018, they accepted about 12% of their students without test scores, but 88% with test scores. So they were test optional, but the vast majority of kids who got an offer of admission had test scores. That changed during the pandemic because of testing access, because of other challenges. Common App reported that on average, score submission rates dropped from 77% to 44%. So the access wreaked havoc. And then a lot of kids just didn't submit testing this year, or last year rather. We don't know how that'll change this year. The Common App, they gave more granular data showing that for schools that were more selective, more kids did submit. So that was strategy, because kids are applying to schools that take fewer students, where it's more competitive. So in those places, the private colleges, whereas in 2019, 9 and 10 kids applying some test scores, it went down to 6 and 10 during the pandemic. In a similar fashion, for the public schools that were more selective, over 10,000 students, and like larger schools like the UVAs and the Georgias and the Michigan, the Texases, that still 2/3 of kids were applying. So even though globally, the rate of submission was 44%, for schools that were larger and more selective, you definitely saw higher rates of applying. So if you're applying to a school that's selective, the majority of kids are sending test scores, even though it's optional at those schools. They're trying to compete in a very tight pack. Additionally, there seems to be a difference in terms of major. And Jeff Zlingo, he's an academic reporter, researcher, author, and he spoke with many people in the field. One admissions officer said, for a big national research school, said 6 and 10 kids sent test scores. However, there are big differences by major. If you're an engineering applicant, 3/4 of the engineers sent test scores, probably to showcase their math scores, their STEM ability. But then if you're going to be a social work major or a gen ed major, then only 1 in 3 sent test scores. So we're seeing that STEM kids are sending test scores at a higher rate. And ultimately the question becomes, like, what do we expect after the pandemic? Like, for one, this is kind of a year of transition. We've really secured more testing. Testing access is now widely available compared to where it was a year ago. And now the ACT, I was on their site earlier today, and they reported that 2.3 million kids have taken it in the last year, which essentially is no drop from before the pandemic. So they really are back. Kids who want testing are getting it. There are still a few markets on the West Coast. Some of our Seattle and California folks say it's still not easy, but there are far fewer cancellations, and they're getting these kids testing. And so are things that go back to where they were before the pandemic? Not all the way back, but there'll be some regression, towards that previous mean, no question. We're not going to see, I don't believe, rates of submission of 40% in the Common App. I think it's going to increase, but I don't know where it's going to land. And I feel like students are going to be more strategic with where they apply. They're going to send their scores to these schools and withhold from these schools. And so, because they're going to get in the testing they need, because before kids might have only had 1 test score. They may have had 3 of their administrations canceled, so they didn't feel comfortable. But now kids are getting in 2 and 3 test scores. They're feeling that like these scores actually do reflect my ability now more than before, when there was more stress, more cancellations. All right, and so there's a question of strategy of, is there a benefit if I send my scores, or am I in the same the same platform as people who have the similar grades, similar rigor, and don't have scores? Is there any advantage? And it's interesting. So the data here is not that broad. Colleges aren't really reporting this that readily. They don't have a reason to. It's not required unless they want to share this. And so, like last year for the early rounds, for the ED kids, Tufts said, we see no difference of the kids who didn't submit test scores, those who did. There was no difference between rates of acceptance. Williams, it was an ever so slight, not a meaningful difference of the kids who applied ED to Williams getting in. But then Penn was the first school we saw where there was a difference that was meaningful, where 6 and 10 kids who applied ED got in, those kids submitted test scores, and 3/4 of the kids who were accepted had test scores. So it's clear here there was a benefit, it seems, for having test scores. Georgetown has always liked testing, and there the rate was much more meaningful. You had a 10.8 acceptance rate for kids applying early to Georgetown. So at 7.3% for kids without test scores, and probably 12% to 13% with test scores. So that's a very meaningful difference between submitters. Then Jeff Zlingo, again, he talks to the admission officers, and he reported these differences. So Emory, if you apply to Emory without test scores, your rate of acceptance was 8.6%. But with test scores, the rate was 17%. That's 100% difference, effectively. Colgate, similar fashion, Without test scores, they're getting in a 12% rate. With test scores, it was 1 in 4 kids. Georgia Tech, 10% got in without test scores and 22% with test scores. So this may jump at you and you might think to yourself, oh, wow. So my odds increase, my odds double if I apply to tech with scores than without. However, that would be a false conclusion because one of the things that Rick Clark said very clearly when he spoke to a group at HECA, I believe, in this conference we attended virtually, he said, you know what, these groups aren't perfectly matched. And so there are differences between these kids. So if you had 2 kids with 9 AP classes, 3.9 GPAs, one has test scores, one without, you wouldn't see an advantage of this size. But he's saying there were differences in terms of the average grades, average academic rigor of kids with scores and without scores. So don't read too much into this, but it does seem like there is some advantage, but this overstates it. There is some benefit for testing, it seems, but it's not as large by any means as this effect size would indicate from this sample. All right, Ginger, I'm going to hand it off back to you.
Sure. So we have lots of students asking us if they should try the test. And as a former school-based college counselor, as well as admissions officer, my answer is always, yes, you should give it a try. You just don't have to tell anybody about it. It's great to get a baseline SAT and ACT score just so you have a sense of where things stand. So every college accepts the SAT and the ACT on equal footing. They have no preference between the 2 tests. They don't care how you get it. They just want you to get your best score and send it to them. So you can give the test a try. Most students have a preference between the 2 tests. They're a little bit different. There are some subtleties to it. About a quarter of students tend to score higher on one than the other. So it's worth trying them both, seeing if either of them suit you, and seeing sort of where your baseline scores are relative to the colleges that you're considering. And if your scores are pretty close or within shooting distance of some of the schools that you're hoping for, then it's probably worth putting the time and the energy into preparing for those tests and doing better on them, because the reality is in 3 months, you can move your test scores further than you probably can your GPA. That would be worthwhile. If your test scores are really out of range for some of the schools that you're hoping for, then you probably want to invest your time and energy in another part of your application. Spend more time developing your writing skills, maybe spend more time on an extracurricular activity that's been really important to you, that's helping you figure out if you want to study something specific when you get to college. Every choice belongs to you as a student in this test optional world. And so you can make those decisions, but you have to have good information to make a good decision. So it's worth getting a baseline, and at Ruth, we do practice tests that you can access online almost every weekend that'll give you a sense of sort of where your scores are relative to the schools that you might be hoping for. We can go to the next slide, Jed. So the question now, once you have scores, so should you try the test? Yes. But then the next and most important question is, should I send my scores of my application? And that answer to that question is the perennial answer of every college admissions counselor I've ever worked with, which is, it depends. It depends on you. It depends on the programs you're applying to. It depends on the colleges you're applying to. It depends on your grades and your test scores. It depends on a lot of stuff. So let's talk about a few of the factors that it depends on. A few of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, are these scores going to add value to my application? Are they something that I want the admissions office to see? Right. So if my test scores are going to raise some questions about my preparation for college, or my ability in the areas that I think that I want to study when I get to college, that's probably not bringing a lot of value. And so you probably don't want to submit those scores. If you are really proud of your scores, if you're the first in your family to go to college and you're really thrilled with kind of your scores saying you're ready for school, you're ready for the challenges that'll come next, and you want to flash those scores to the colleges you're applying to, then by all means send them. But those are, your decision, and these are some of the questions that you want to consider. We also asked these questions of some of our colleagues in the admissions world and wanted to share some of their answers with you. So as Jed mentioned earlier, Jeff Zlingo is a noted author and researcher in the field of education, and his findings, particularly in the pandemic year, was that the numbers were skewed in quantitative fields. So often when you're in college admissions, there are faculty from your intended department who are sitting in on the admissions committee, and that's particularly true for engineering, and often true for business as well. So if you're saying, I know what I want to do when I get there, the experts in those fields are really going to scrutinize those parts of your application, and they are scientists, and so they believe really strongly in data, so they are going to be more compelled by those standardized test scores. So that's part of the reason why you're seeing that kind of bias towards test scores and higher test scores in some of these STEM fields. So that's what Jeff had to say. We also talked with Jamie Hasner, who's at Texas Tech, who's a wonderful colleague. And her recommendation is that you look at each college's academic profile as you make a decision about whether or not to send scores. Colleges typically report their middle 50% range. So they're saying, half of the students we admitted last year scored in this range. That's what a middle 50% range is. It also means half of the students they admitted did not score in that range. 25% of them scored above the top of it. 25% of them scored below the bottom of it. Typically, that bottom quartile is comprised of students the university wanted to admit for their own reasons. And so if your scores are sort of in that middle group, in that middle 50% range or higher, then that's probably a good idea to submit your scores. And students whose scores are lower in that bottom quartile are well advised to withhold their scores. Now that has a consequence year after year, as you can imagine, right? If we continue in this test optional world, if a quarter of the students effectively opt not to send their test scores because they're lower, that middle 50% is going to be increasing and inching up a little bit year after year, which is of course what a college admissions office might like to present to the following year's class to say, look how hard it was to get in here. We also spoke with Sean Felton, who's a wonderful colleague at Cornell, and he's an ethnomusicologist by training. So he's someone who thinks a lot about different kinds of students based on their interests and their passions and the things that they hope to pursue in college and beyond. He, sort of looking at that middle 50% range at Cornell, he feels like there's sort of a threshold at which your scores are not going to hurt you. And he feels that's like at about a 650 or higher, your scores aren't going to hold you back. Your scores are saying you are completely ready to do the work at any of these colleges and you can do it very well. But anything below that probably would not be something that would send the message you want to a school as selective as Cornell. Sean also went on to say, on the next slide, I think, that it really does depend on the program. So Cornell is a university that has several undergraduate colleges that have different specializations. So if you were particularly pursuing a passion in the fine arts, or if you're, a classically trained violist, your test scores are not going to be nearly as important as the audition you present. So different situations based on on the student themselves, their talents and strengths, the programs they're applying to, as well as the schools they're applying to. And then finally, Rick Clark, who's a good friend here in Atlanta, wrote a great book about going through the college application process as a family, really suggests that if your scores are in the top half of that middle 50% range, they cannot hurt you, right? They're not going to be anything that holds you back, raises a red flag, causes any concern in the admissions process. And if your scores are lower than that, if your test scores are lower than that, but you think it's a good representation of you as a student, send it. But if they're lower than that, Rick says I wouldn't send it, and I got to tell you, if Rick Clark says don't send it, I wouldn't send it. I think go with your strengths is good advice to any student in any circumstance. Excellent.
And we'll throw in one more factor here, which has to do with the balance between your grades and your test scores. So if a student has an incredible GPA, really, really strong grades, they have a 3.8, 3.9, unweighted, a lot of rigor in there, but then they have a relatively weak test score. The question is, what do you want to be the conversation in that room when they're looking at your application? That this kid has a 3.8, 3.9, all this great rigor, doing great, other things. Oh, and this got a 23 or a 24, or just the entire conversation is all about the academic, is the grades and the rigor. And so throwing in a relatively soft score isn't going to help you. So if your grades are outstanding, I would lean on those more heavily. And so because there are, the majority of kids, 2/3 of students, their test scores and their grades are in lockstep. But then that third can be divided in half, where 1/6 of the kids, they have higher grades than scores, and 1/6 have higher scores than grades. And so ultimately, if you have, really amazing grades, low scores, withhold it. If you have really strong scores, I would send that. And so, it can give you a boost in that regard. But if your grades are exceptional, I would just lean on those and have that be the narrative when they're talking about your application. Okay. Now, when it comes to the scores, there's one more level of nuance. So you have different section scores. And if kids who are applying the different programs, these sections matter at different levels. So I have a 1400 on the SAT. Now, that what matters here, if I'm applying to an engineering program, my math score matters more, because I'm going to be taking a lot more advanced math classes over the course of my 4 years in engineering. So if I have an 800 on math and a 6 on verbal, that 6 on verbal is a little bit soft for that college, but the 8 on math, that shows strength and ability in the most important area for my application. So for sure you send that. However, if you're the aspiring engineer and you have a 6 on math, I probably wouldn't send that one, because that's showing a area of a relative weakness. Still a decent score, but again, for a top program, other engineers who probably have scores in the 700s, I probably wouldn't want to compete in that pool with my 6. I just go optional. I wouldn't send my scores to that school. And this can be the whole dilemma. If you have a strong score in one area and a weak in the other, it depends how strong and how weak. And sometimes I just need to hide that weak score, and I'll lose the pop at the high one, but it's worth it. Versus other times I have an 8, I have a 36 on math on the ACT and a 25 on reading. But again, I'm applying to a computer science program. So my math score matters a lot more. It's a lot more logic and other things. So I'll eat the 25 to show off my 30, my 35, 36. So that, and it's a balancing act. There's definitely nuance here. What are your scores, and to where are you applying? Talk to your counselor. That was a note there, and ask them for advice whether to send or withhold. And then there's a thing that we've heard from one admissions officer at a very, very prominent school, in a very selective school on the East Coast. He was talking about, he saw one student had a great grades, great rigor, everything was lovely, but then the student submitted a very low test score, and he said he couldn't unsee it. Like it became a key part of the conversation. The student has a 94 on his classes, but then he got a 1 on an AP exam or things like that, and then like I can't unsee that. Now it colors my perception of the quality of the class and the teacher in the school when you have such bad performance when it comes down to the assessment. So that's to say, weak scores, you don't want to pollute an otherwise nice conversation with a relatively weak score. So that's just kind of a theme here throughout. You want to treat every school differently. It's not, I scored a 30, therefore I'm going to apply to every school or withhold from every school. Treat every school individually. And so maybe I have my 30, I'm going to send that 30 to 3 schools, but withhold from 4 schools. And you're going to have to choose in the Common App, do I send scores or not send scores? And you can do it school by school, whether you send or withhold. And that should be a thought out position based on their score range and if it's going to help you or hurt you. So that definitely is part of the balance here, is the strategy. An example of this is Swarthmore. Their mid-50 range from a year ago. For the verbal, their middle 50, half the class is in that 680, 750 range. Math is higher, 790 range. So their composite range is 1380 to 1540. So the question is, do I withhold or send my scores? Now, if you are in the top quartile, if I score a 1550, obviously that's a slam dunk. You send the score. If I score in the second quartile, I score a 1480, that's a score you want to send. If you're in the bottom quartile, from below a 1380, if I get like a 1330, that's probably not going to impress the folks at Swarthmore. They used to higher scores. Their average score is a 1470. And so I'd probably withhold and just have them consider my rigor and my grades. The question really becomes that third quartile, where it's the whole thing is, where are you? Do I have a 1380 or a 1460? A 1460 is right under the mean. I'll probably send that score. Or also, how are my grades? If I have 1380, but I have relatively strong grades and I have like a 3.8, I'll probably withhold it and edge toward my grades. However, if my grades aren't as strong, then I could send that score. And also, is there a strong section score that'll help me with a certain program I'm applying to? Am I an engineer and there is a 750 in there, but a much weaker verbal? I'll still send it to get that 750 as part of my discussion of my, again, for those people on faculty who are reading my application. So again, there's this nuance here. It's strategy, it's being thoughtful and deliberate, and every school is different. So it is now 8:46. I have some other slides, but I see we have some questions already teeing up. So let's pause for a moment and field some of these questions.
Sounds great. Okay, so we have one person asking, would you recommend dual enrollment classes? And I'm happy to answer that just from an admissions perspective. It really does depend on what opportunities you have in your environment. Most college admissions offices want to see students taking advantage of the most rigorous classes in their high school before they start looking beyond their high school for opportunities. That said, dual enrollment can make college incredibly affordable, since you can, if you really pursue a dual enrollment path with rigor, you can even complete an associate's degree as you're graduating from high school. So that would really depend on the family's circumstance, but the most selective schools really do urge you to take the most rigorous classes at your high school, which may be AP classes or an IB diploma program, before pursuing dual enrollment. But in the end, your goal is to be ready for college, right? And so it's whatever opportunities your high school and circumstances afford you that let you be ready for that. Another person is asking, how do people receive merit scholarships if they don't take the SAT or have modest scores? Jed, do you want to start answering that? Sure.
Yeah, it'll vary by college. There were colleges, and in some cases it wasn't stated explicitly on their website. We heard a talk from the head of admissions at Brandeis, and she was saying that they were test optional before the pandemic. Now they have, and they still are, but they accepted about 9 out of 10 kids with test scores and 10% without scores. So there was a lane, it was a small lane, but she said effectively the way they allocate merit-based aid was predicated upon your grades and test scores. So effectively, if you don't have test scores, you weren't getting merit-based aid at Brandeis. There are some colleges who during the pandemic have decoupled their merit-based aid from test scores, but many haven't. Like I showed you the Wabash in Alabama and other schools too. In Mississippi, there are a number of southern schools where they have these matrices of test scores and GPA, and those are still in place. That's part of the thing with Florida also, where it's school by school. There is no one rule. They do it how they want to do it. And so part of it is you checking with the school, looking on their website. You can reach out to the admissions office and find out in terms of their merit-based scholarships, are they or are they not tied to tied to test scores? But there definitely has been a movement during the pandemic. If we're test optional, can we not tie the merit-based awards to testing? But some of them still have it in place. So it's admissions optional, but test required for merit-based aid. Every school is different.
Thanks, Jed. We've got a couple of questions that I think are a little bit related. If someone is applying to a college that say sort of has a test score average that's around a 1350 and their scores are around 1100, does that seem like a good place to choose the test optional path rather than submitting scores? And another person is asking, what is out of range? Is that 10 points? Like what, how far out of, what number kind of puts you out of range? If you could address those dual questions together.
Okay. And in that regard, in terms of if my average score is a 1350 and I have a sub 1100, so I would need 250 to get in the range of where they want me to be. And so if I have like a 1050, that'd be a 300-point lift. That big of a lift, I would probably say focus on other areas. In terms of if I was coming with an 1180, the whole thing is how big of a lift. Is it 150 points? That can be done. But a 300-point lift, it happens, but it's less likely. And so in that regard, I would like to be within 150 points of that middle range for me to feel like it's a good investment of my energy and resources. That's a general rule of thumb I would throw out there. We see kids go up 300, 400 points, but it's, again, this is more the exception than the rule. So as a range, out of range score, 10 points. I'm not sure if that's 10 points on the SAT or the ACT. If we're talking the ACT, then 10 points would be a lot to lift. That's a heavy lift. Like we, on average at Apple Ruth, our people are getting around 5 points or so on the ACT. So that means if I'm starting off with a baseline score of a 23, on average, our kids are with 20 hours of work are getting up to a 28. It's like 5.5 points. So if I were 10 points behind, if my school wants a 30 and I have a 20, in that regard, I probably would say focus on other areas. But again, if our average score is a 5-point gain with 20 hours of work. So if you know the midpoint's of 30 and I have a 25, you know, I can get up there and get to that place where it could be a benefit for me. And especially if you have even higher than that. So it's roughly, you know, about 100, 150 points or so on the SAT and about 4 or 5 points on the ACT. That's, you know, if we can get within that range, but if you're below that, if you're 8 points below, I wouldn't focus so much on testing in that regard. That's when benefit from it, focus on your essay, activities, and so forth. Save the resources and time and energy. Okay.
Thanks, Jed.
Sure.
I think this is a really wonderful question to linger on for a minute. Are schools expecting lower scores in general after COVID? I've heard many students say they're not retaining as much information from class due to distance learning, which I would think would equate to lower scores. What are your thoughts on that, Jed? All
right. So in terms of learning loss through a more challenging medium of learning, my sense of this is that the learning loss is taking place more on the school setting and less in terms of test preparation. And it may be the immediacy of testing and you have stuff right in front of you and you have you're working with the materials directly. You're doing practice tests from your home, which aren't very different. There's a lot of work that's done at home. Like, so if you do a class of test prep, it's going to be, you know, 20 hours with a teacher or tutor, but then 40 plus hours is you doing the work, time drills, so forth, which really aren't different. Then, so the remote aspect, and also we've been doing remote learning for 10 years at Apple Ruth. We started doing, it was WebEx back in the day, and then WebEx, and we did a number of things. And finally, we've had 4 years of doing Zoom. So the world was, you know, Zoom was new to the world. We've been doing Zoom for 4 years. And for us, our data shows that there is no difference of our in-person versus a remote student. So I wouldn't expect, and honestly, we have the data from our thousands of students in the past year or two, that we aren't seeing score declines. So I think the learning loss may be the interference of a teacher doing an AP class, having to limit their curriculum, how much can they cover, trying to also teachers who are new to Zoom, who are new versus we have a decade of experience doing this. And so we haven't seen the decline in scores from our students. And I can say that we're looking at our data, it shows that. Okay.
And I think just to clarify sort of a different situation, perhaps the questioner is thinking about some of those standardized tests that students take for their state, like we take Georgia milestones here in Georgia and that sort of thing. So a competency test that's sort of based on what content you covered in class, like the AP exams that Jed was talking about, would be different than something like the SAT or ACT, which is really testing how well you take the test, rather than something that your teacher taught you in school necessarily. If you get a 3 on an AP exam, should you send it?
All right. I mean, this is the, you could ask, well, it's going to depend upon the school to which you're applying. And if I'm applying to UGA, I could send my 3. If I'm applying to MIT, probably not. And part of it, the schools actually post what they give credit for. And so MIT will have very clearly what they accept for, you know, AP Calc, AB, BC, differential. They're going to have like, they'll give credit for a 4 for differential equations. They'll give credit for a 5 for BC. They're going to, and so there are schools where I've seen schools where it's mostly they'll take 3s, but for certain hard APs, they'll take a 3. And for computer science or whatever it is. So part of it is you going on the schools, typing in credit for APs for this college, and they'll be posted what they want to accept. So that's the best indicator. But yeah, some schools you send, typically, even if a school doesn't give credit for a 4, the general guidance is send your 4s and 5s, because those are passing scores. That shows a level of mastery of the content, even if they don't give you credit. And some schools, like Dartmouth, some schools aren't giving college credit in the same way towards graduation, but still it sends a signal. It's confirmatory evidence that you know something about this topic and you've achieved a certain level of mastery. But a 1 or a 2, the consensus is keep those to yourself, let them dwell, let them wonder, was it a 3? But don't tell them you got a 1.
Or maybe you just were sick that day, or
Maybe
you
you're
didn't
sick.
take the test, or we just don't know.
That's right. That's right.
Leave it shrouded in mystery. No one needs to know what you were doing that day.
I like it. Leave the mystery intact.
All right, we've got 5 minutes left, Jed, and I think it might be kind of fun to do the lightning round if you're up for sharing a few of the case studies that you put together.
Exactly. So case studies, lightning round. Here we go through a few caveats about the score ranges. They might shift this year. We expect, because again, it's not a normal year. A lot of kids who didn't do well did send their test scores, but also kids who were sending them didn't have the full exposure to 3 full tests like in previous times. So we don't know still have score averages increased or decreased. We'll learn that over the next probably year or so. Here are 4 or 5 fast case studies. Moira, 760 on verbal, 640 on math, 14 flat. GPA 3.9 unweighted. Rigor, pretty good. Applying at Tufts, and middle 50 is 680 to 750 for verbal, 710, 790 on math. So that 760 on verbal is great. That's the top of the profile, but that 640 you're in the bottom. So a 1400 composite is just over the bottom quartile. So in that case, and then the 3.9 is also very strong. So our instinct is that 640 is weak enough for Tufts, because again, their middle 50 math is going to be, their math is 710 to 790. A 640 puts you as a pretty weak math student compared to their average student. So we said, you know what, your 3.9 is so good, go with your grades, keep the score to yourself. That was our assessment there for Moira. Stevie has a 640 verbal, 580 math, 3.4, 3.5 GPA. It's going to apply to architecture, is applying to VA Tech. And their mid 50 is a 590, 680 for verbal, 590, 710 on math. So the 580 in math puts you on the low end, the bottom quartile, and you're applying to a more math heavy major. So we felt, again, let's not send that score, because again, that math score of 580 may give someone pause if you're applying to a STEM engineering architecture kind of degree. Okay, David has a 33 ACT, 1450 SAT, 750 verbal, 700 math, 404 weighted, applying to Penn, and Penn has a mid range of 32 to 35, 760 verbal, 750 to 800 of math. So the question is, David is right in the cusp. He has a 700 plus on both sections, although his math is relatively low for Penn. His 700 math, Penn wants a 750 to 800 on math. So, but both scores are right there with, the ACT, the ST. We decided, let's go ahead and send it, because together they send a clear picture of this kid's is good at testing, strong on verbal, almost the top quartile for verbal. And so go ahead and send those scores in. Alexis has a 29 on the ACT, 4.4 weighted, has 6 APs, applying to Indiana, Rutgers, Penn State, Emory, Cornell, and Texas Austin. So we said, let's send that 29 to Indiana. You're right in the middle range, to Rutgers also, and Penn State. You're almost top of that mid 50 range. However, I would not send that score to Emory, where their middle 50 is 31 to 34, you're below, and Cornell is 32 to 35. And Texas has a big range. So for UT, it would depend if you're applying in-state or out-of-state. If you're applying in-state, I would probably send it. Out-of-state, it's going to be tougher. I probably withhold it. All right. And then last, we have Roland, 33 ACT, 4.2 weighted, all honors and APs, applying to Haverford, Skidmore, and Oberlin. So, and then Haverford, 31 to 34, Skidmore, 20 to 32, Oberlin, 30 to 33. So you are solid everywhere. That 33 is good for Skidmore, Haverford, Oberlin. Send it away everywhere you go, everywhere you're applying. All right. And that is the end of our lightning round. And so now, oh, there's a poll.
Yes.
Before we go, Ginger,
So
let's
before
yeah.
we let you go, we'd love to know how we can help you shine this semester. So if we can, we're going to launch one quick poll to wrap us up, so we have a sense of the best way that we can help you. At Alparuth, we help students find their confidence to achieve their goals, whatever they are. We work with students on executive function skills, academic tutoring, as well as standardized test prep. So let us know how we can help you this semester. We'd love to be a helpful part of your process if we can be. If there are questions or concerns we can help with along the way, we hope you won't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Jed, for sharing your insight and deep dive into the data analysis. For all of these interesting questions. And as Jed mentioned, you'll be receiving a copy of tonight's presentation, as well as a recording if you weren't able to listen or jot down all the notes you wanted to while you were with us tonight. Thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great night.